So it's my pleasure to have Professor de Lathauwer here from KU Leuven, where he's a professor. He is also a fellow of the IEEE and of SIAM, as well as the associate editor for the SIAM Journal of Matrix Analysis and Applications. And primarily, from my own experience with his excellent work, world-renowned and very influential expert on multilinear algebra, tensor decompositions, and their applications more generally. So I'm really happy to have him here to talk about what he's been up to recently, and I'll turn things over and stop wasting his time.
Thank you for the introduction. Okay, good evening. Well, for me, good evening. For some of you, good afternoon. I'll be talking about, as you can see, from analysis to learning, tensor methods. And the idea is that people working on tensor methods, this is really well known, and that tensors provide important new tools for data analysis. And in this talk, I will introduce something new that will make clear that tensors also provide new tools for machine learning. Quite surprising. And so the talk is organized also according to these two parts. And there is a first part on data analysis, and then the second part on machine learning. In the first part, so the part on data analysis, that will be a bit tutorial-like introductory style. So also people who are not very familiar should learn some interesting things about basic use of tensor methods in this part. And in particular, I will talk about the canonical polyadic decomposition and a generalization block term decomposition. And in that part, it's not only just a survey, but the survey will be used to introduce various elements that will reappear in a different way in the second part on learning. So let's start with the first part, data analysis, and with the first decomposition, the canonical polyadic decomposition. If you don't know what that is, it's really simple. Tensor decomposition in rank 1 terms. And if it's the minimal number of rank 1 terms, then this decomposition is called the canonical polyadic decomposition. It's like the straightforward extension of decomposing a matrix in a minimal number of rank 1 terms, so a rank decomposition. And if you really don't know what is these three vectors and the tensor product here is, it's also just a straight generalization of the matrix case. So here you see a rank 1 matrix, and the element at position ij is just the product of the corresponding 2 entries. Here you have the product of the corresponding 3 entries, or corresponding 4 entries, or corresponding 7 entries, depending on the order of the tensor. So that's the definition. It's very, very simple, very basic. And now the first surprising thing is that this decomposition, this CPD, is unique under very mild conditions. Very mild conditions means that we don't need things like orthogonality or triangularity or that kind of stuff that makes matrix decompositions unique. There are some conditions, but they are really mild and easily satisfied in applications. And why is that important? Well, it's important because if this tensor is a data tensor, then if this decomposition is unique and these rank 1 terms actually mean something physical, then here you have a new tool for finding underlying components in data with minimal assumptions. You don't need underlying signals to be orthogonal or have some very special structures to be able to retrieve them. The conditions are really, really very mild, and you can retrieve the underlying components in principle very easily thanks to this uniqueness. Okay. Wait, for some reason the button here didn't work. So, okay, this is the matrix situation, the typical situation when you try to find factors and underlying variables in a data matrix. You look for rank 1 terms, and the problem is that at the matrix level, a decomposition in rank 1 terms is not unique. You can stack all the F vectors in some F matrix and all the G vectors in some G matrix, and then you have here any non-singular matrix that you put here and its inverse gives you a new factorization. So this is obvious. Decomposition in rank 1 terms in the matrix case is not unique. And so you don't have this nice property. So really with the CPD for tensors, you have a new tool. And then you could say, okay, wait a second. The most typical decomposition in rank 1 terms is the dyadic decomposition in an SVD. And that is unique. If the singular values are distinct, you have a unique decomposition. So what is the problem? Well, that this decomposition does not solve the same problem anymore, because all the U vectors now are mutually orthogonal vectors. And also the V vectors here, the right singular vectors, are also mutually orthogonal. So you have made the decomposition unique by imposing in an SVD that U is an orthogonal matrix, V is an orthogonal matrix. But maybe if you're looking for components in data, you don't have this double orthogonality. So SVD is really, really nice. For low rank approximation, for finding dominant subspaces, for numerical computations, for compression, but not for solving the problem of finding rank 1 terms in data. So this is a little application to make it even more clear. It's one of the prototypical applications in tensor methods, and it comes from chemometrics. So in chemometrics, things are, for instance, take excitation emission spectroscopy. That is, you take a chemical sample, and the spectrometer for your chemical sample will measure a matrix. With in one direction emission wavelength and in the other direction excitation wavelength. And now there is a law, a chemical law, Beer-Lambert's law, that tells you that this data matrix can be decomposed in rank 1 terms. And every rank 1 term is the contribution of one fluorescent component in your chemical mixture. And so you have, let's say, really chemical things in your mixture, and they all produce spectra, and they all show up in the form of these rank 1 terms, with the pure excitation spectrum and the pure emission spectrum in every rank 1 term. So this is one of these typical applications, and you have a data matrix and you would like to know what chemicals are present in your mixture. And you can do that if you can find this decomposition in rank 1 matrices, but you can't. Because it's not unique, it's not an SVD, and these things are non-negative because they are spectra. So there are no negative elements that can make some inner product 0. It's actually a non-negative matrix factorization, but a non-negative matrix factorization is not unique either in general. So at this point, the conclusion is that you won't find the chemical components using matrix techniques. And so then at some point, people came to the understanding that if somehow they can start from a data tensor, they can use this CPD, where here you have now, so what they do is they take several samples with the same chemical components, but in different concentrations. And the concentrations now show up in this third dimension. Then you have the CPD. CPD is very easily unique. And so you can know what is in your data, and you can extract the pure excitation spectra, the pure emission spectra, and the concentrations. And so the whole thing is you tensorized the problem. And the tensorization here, so going from a matrix to a tensor, happened by considering several samples at the same time. We will see different instances of tensorization later on. Okay, so far so good, and we have a new tool that is interesting, and a decomposition that is unique, and the uniqueness is the magic. Let's have a closer look at this uniqueness. Actually, the story of uniqueness is a long and complicated story. And over the years, by now you can say over decades, people have been studying this CPD under milder and milder and milder conditions, and proving that more general and more general scenarios, larger and larger ranks, and proving or deriving mild conditions under which the decomposition is unique. This is actually still an ongoing story. It's not 100% understood yet, but the vast area has been covered, but not everything. So I will just show two results. The most basic result is that if all these A vectors here are linearly independent, not orthogonal, but linearly independent, and all the B vectors are linearly independent, and among the C vectors you don't have proportional vectors, then it's unique. Actually, if you have only two matrix slices, you would have a matrix pencil. And you know that under these conditions, you can compute the generalized eigenvalue decomposition of that matrix pencil. And of course, if the pencil, which just consists of two matrix slices, yields a unique generalized eigenvalue decomposition, you can infer the result and generalize it to the entire decomposition. So that's really weak, and there is no orthogonality, and like this linear independence of the spectra was satisfied in the example. Of course, the concentrations will not be proportional, etc., or a very small chance. So this is one example. Okay, now in my previous slide, I assumed that two of the factor matrices had full column rank. So let's take it one step further and relax the condition and assume that there is only one factor matrix of which we know that it has full column rank. Here I took this matrix to be the C matrix. Then you can generalize the theory. It becomes much more complicated, of course. And the thing is, from the other two matrices, you can construct another matrix, here this matrix U. It's the derivation is a bit complicated, and in the end you obtain a theorem, and it says that if this new matrix U and the C matrix, which you already assume to have full column rank, if both of them have full column rank, then the CPD is unique, and you can still somehow find the decomposition through a generalized eigenvalue decomposition. You see here these 2x2 determinants. These 2x2 determinants will somehow play the role of a rank 1 detector. If you have rank 1 structures, these determinants will be 0, and in a clever way you can obtain this theorem. Now you can say, okay, this is nice. So we have a theorem, but there is a downside. This U matrix is obtained from A and B, And there is also this condition on C, but A, B, and C are actually what we want to find. We know the tensor and we would like to find the decomposition. So it's a theorem in which the condition is written in terms of the factor matrices that are actually your unknowns. So it's interesting, but maybe not very practical. Well, there exists variants of this theorem where from your tensor T, you can derive matrices. Here it's a matrix P instead of a matrix U. The C matrix, I mean, you can replace it by something else. And in the end, you will have a theorem that tells you that if a certain P matrix that you can construct from your tensor has a null space of dimension R, R being the rank of your CPD, and the C matrix and some flattening of your tensor will have a certain rank, etc. Under these assumptions, it's still guaranteed, and the CPD is unique and can be computed by means of a generalized eigenvalue decomposition. And it actually works in the following way, that from the tensor, you can construct an auxiliary tensor. And this auxiliary tensor is such that all the factor matrices have full column rank. So for the auxiliary tensor, the first theorem was satisfied. And then you use the first theorem to do the generalized eigenvalue decomposition, and you can solve the more general problem. Okay. There are even more general conditions like Kruskals and even others, but I won't discuss. Okay, so far so good. We have a new tool. It's unique under conditions that we understand quite well. We have computations based on generalized eigenvalue decomposition, and now the trouble starts. In reality, the situation is not like you have a data tensor and you find the decomposition such that the sum of rank 1 terms is exactly equal to your data tensor. There is always noise. The data are imperfect. And everything that I have been saying so far is like an ideal picture in which we assumed that everything was exact, that there is no noise, no imperfections and everything. What does that mean? Well, in reality, we will work as follows. What I said is still true, but in an approximate sense. You can still do these computations and they will give some approximation of the CPD you are interested in. And in reality, the decomposition, so the sum of rank 1 terms, will moreover, maybe initialized by this generalized eigenvalue decomposition, be matched to your data by an optimization-based algorithm. So you really try to minimize the difference between the data and the CPD you are looking for. And here you can see some convergence plots. Very often this works really nicely. So tensors are not as problematic as they are sometimes portrayed in the literature or in talks, but sometimes things can be difficult. And here you clearly see something that is not nice. You see some convergence of a cost function, and it doesn't do anything for 100, 200 iterations, sometimes thousands iterations. And all of a sudden, something happens and it really starts to converge. These things are called swamps. And yeah, this is not nice because if your algorithm behaves that way, then chances are high that you will just stop your algorithm there and think it has converged. It has not converged. It's going through some swamp, and all of a sudden, convergence can take place, or maybe will never take place. This is, of course, the price to pay for the generality of the CPD and the interest of the tool. We made almost no assumptions on the rank 1 terms. Definitely not orthogonality and things like that, which means if you have a decomposition with so little constraints that it can happen that definitely as you are iterating, some terms might get close, get an opposite sign, you can enter into all kinds of numerical difficulties, and this can explain what is going on here. Little by little things are happening, and there is still something going on, but numerically it's a nightmare. And that's the price to pay for the generality of the tool. Okay. One additional thing that I want to mention about this computation is that very often in applications, for instance, in the chemometrics application, you have here a tensor of size, let's say 200 by 50 by 10 or something. So this is large, and you have only like 3 chemical components that are of interest. So you only want to find a rank 3 decomposition. The way this is very often done is first by orthogonally compressing everything to a small tensor, let's say 3 by 3 by 3 or 4 by 4 by 4, 5 by 5 by 5, with some orthogonal matrices, then compute the CPD of the small tensor S here. And so here you have the small matrices, and once this is done at low cost, then you expand again using the orthogonal matrices, and you go back to your original dimensions, maybe some little refinement, and you're done. This orthogonal compression can be done SVD style. So what happens is that so basically you're building an orthonormal basis for the column space, the row space, the fiber space. And so what you can do is put all the columns of this tensor one after the other in a very long matrix and look at the dominant subspace. There you have U1. Then put all the rows one after the other in a very long matrix, look at the dominant subspace, and you have U2, etc., etc., etc. This is called multilinear singular value decomposition or Tucker decomposition. And so it's important to keep in mind from this slide that this orthogonal compression uses, for instance, 3 SVDs of different flattenings of this tensor, all columns one after the other, all rows one after the other, all fibers one after the other. And it's this U1, U2, U3, these 3 green matrices that you use for the compression. This will come back later. Okay, so we had the swamps and the numerical issues. This is like a disease. It can be worse. It might not even live. So if you try to compute a CPD approximation, this best approximation might not even exist. These are things that can occur. For instance, here you have a data tensor Y, and you want to compute, it's actually rank 3, and you want to compute its best rank 2 approximation. And you approach it and you approach it and you approach it until like the border of the rank 2 region. And here there is bad news because this is an open set. So you go to the border and you will actually never reach the border. So the best approximation does not exist. And this will also give weird things like rank 1 terms diverging to infinity, etc., etc., etc. So in general, this is imposed. It does not always happen in practice. Maybe it occurs not so often in practice, but it can happen in practice. Okay. There are some remedies, but I won't discuss them. But what I will briefly mention is that very often people present this as like, okay, so you can have these swamps, difficult, maybe it's ill-posed. So it's a nightmare. Well, actually, it depends on how you look at it. If you see this, like this ill-postness and rank 1 terms going to infinity and partially canceling out, etc., you can also see this as a benefit. Namely, you see that something is going wrong. And if something is going wrong with the algorithm is trying to tell you something. Namely, clearly what you're looking for is not there or it does not make sense. And this can mean several things. It can mean, for instance, that your noise level is too high and you are too ambitious. You're trying to find rank 1 terms that you cannot find. The problem is too difficult. Or maybe you are looking for 2 rank 1 terms, but the tensor is rank 3. And that's the reason you need to look for 3 rank 1 terms. Or maybe you are looking for rank 1 terms as like underlying variables, but there are no underlying variables that take the form of a rank 1 term. There are some underlying variables, but they have a less simple structure, and so on and so forth. So what is often presented as a problem is actually also something that you can use to your own advantage. Okay, but general message is CPD is not necessarily an animal that is easy to deal with, but in principle it's useful, and most of the time it works really well. Okay, one application. Here we have a data matrix. It's electroencephalogram data. And we want to find what is happening here. What are the underlying mechanisms in this EEG data? And you can say it's a matrix. So your question does not make sense. We cannot solve this for matrices. And I say that's true. And so first thing what we will do is, like in the chemometrics example, we will tensorize the problem. Here we are not going to take several patients, but we will mathematically tensorize. And how will we do that? Well, we will map every row of this EEG data to a matrix. So if we do that for every row, the matrix becomes a tensor. The tool that we use here, we can use various tools, is a bi-orthogonal wavelet. So every row vector becomes a matrix, the matrix becomes a tensor, and its rank 1 terms are shown here. The first one shows eye blinks, and the second one shows the nearly periodical behavior of an epileptic seizure. And you get these things out for free thanks to the uniqueness of the CPD, without assuming orthogonality, etc., which is not there. So this is an application. Okay. Now, next step is checking the time. Yeah, we're fine. Okay, so this is the CPD again. Then you could say, look, we have been analyzing EEG data, and the underlying components that we were looking for, actually, we have still been making very, very severe assumptions. Namely, we are looking for underlying medical phenomena that are such that if you can isolate them in a rank 1 term, they are such that all columns are proportional, all rows are proportional, all fibers are proportional. And that seems to be like a magical property of physical things happening in the human brain. I don't think so. This is, again, this is mathematical fiction, and it's not going to be like this. So what you could do is say, look, here, actually, this rank 1 term, you can see it as a rank 1 matrix that is scaled along the third dimension. Maybe you can do the following. You take a low rank matrix and you scale it. With low rank matrices, you can model more things. Or maybe you can just have low rank in all directions instead of just rank 1. And this is then a block term decomposition, and this is still unique under mild conditions. So here we are really entering the tensor game with new tools that allow you to find things in data that by no means you can do using matrices. But of course, this is very, very general. No orthogonality, not even rank 1, and all the problems and numerical problems and robustness, etc., that I have mentioned, a fortiori apply here also. And so this can be a nightmare in practice, but very often it works. And for instance, for realistic epileptic seizures, you will really need these block terms, but can be a challenge to find. Okay, so we are in part 2 of the talk, and we take the step from data analysis to learning. And I'm going to explain it like this. This is a fragment of an Escher painting, and you see here a person working out a tensor problem, and it's difficult. So that is what we have been doing so far. So we have the data, and we try to understand what is going on inside, and very often this works, but very often this can also be difficult. On the other hand, this is kind of a riddle, and if there is a riddle, very often there is like an out-of-the-box answer to the problem, and the out-of-the-box answer is here. Assume there are 2 people, and you can see for each of them they are trying to solve a difficult problem, but what is easy to see is that they are solving the same problem. So if you change your view and you say, look, what we want to do is compare things and see whether the same thing is going on the left as on the right, maybe this is really easy. So that's the second part of the talk. So what do I mean by comparing things? So we are now dealing with 2 tensors, A and B, which have CPDs or some other decomposition like a BTD. And I would like to know if these columns are the same for A and B, the rows are the same for A and B, and maybe say the fibers are different. Here you have a matrix U3 and a matrix V3, but let's say the columns and the rows are the same. We have several variants of this. Maybe even in the 3rd dimension, you have the same thing and the scaling coefficients are different. So, I mean, it's very general, but this is to explain what I mean. And so part of the structure is the same. And then I could say, okay, I will decompose A, I will decompose B, and let's see. But then we are in the situation of 2 people working out a very difficult problem, and we don't want that. We just want to see whether the components are the same, not necessarily computing them. If we can avoid computing them, that would be nice. And so how is this going to work? Well, I mentioned a few slides ago that we have these matrix flattenings with SVDs. And for the compression, we use this green U matrices. Here for the new problem, the similarity, I will use the matrix of right singular vectors, which is also easy to compute. It's an SVD, so it's matrix algebra. It's not we're not dealing with swamps here. So okay, again we can present several results of increasing complexity, and the first result that I will present is that at least you know what kind of decomposition you are dealing with. So you have 2 tensors A and B, and for instance, you know that they both admit CPDs. That's it. So here we have 2 tensors A and B, and let etc. B rank R CPDs. At least that is a given. And then we have a theorem And the theorem resembles very closely the second theorem that I presented in my presentation here. Namely, the third matrix here has full column rank. Also here, the third matrix has full column rank. And then there is something derived from the other two matrices with 2x2 determinants and a larger matrix. And my second assumption is that this one has also full column rank. So far, conditions 1 and 2 are the conditions that already appeared in this presentation. And now we have a third one for matching A and B. And it says that the span of two of the flattenings are the same. And this is actually the identity of something with these V matrices here. That's this third condition. If this is true, then A and B have the same columns and the same rows in their CPDs. And here again, so you have a formulation of the theorem in terms of the factor matrices that you're actually looking for. So it's interesting, but maybe not so practical. We have this for CPD, but we also have this for the more complicated BTD. And also with easy conditions. This is a formulation of the theorem starting from the data instead of the factor matrices, with some flattenings for which you need to have a certain rank. This P matrix this time, which needs to have a null space of dimension R. And here the equality of the V matrices or at least the subspaces so to match the two decompositions. And then you know that A and B have the same columns and rows in the CPDs, and you can extend this to BTDs. So far we assumed that A and B admit CPDs. But maybe you don't even know that. Maybe they admit the more general BTDs, and then it's a complete nightmare. So
Can I ask a quick question? Sorry.
Sure, sure.
This theorem is interesting, and I like it. I'm wondering if I had a tensor A that I knew admitted a rank R CPD, and I didn't know that B did, and these three conditions were satisfied, is there any way that I could conclude that B then also had a rank R CPD? Could I maybe use a re-engineered version of this as a test for being rank R?
I would have to look up the details myself now.
Okay.
We wrote a paper a few years ago, and I can improvise, but I prefer not to do that. Okay. But I can look this up for you.
Okay, that would be interesting. Thanks a lot.
Okay. This is an application example. Let me check time again. It's actually so the chemometrics example, where we have now two chemometrics tensors. And here we look at the canonical angles between the two subspaces that need to be the same. And so the row spaces instead of the green U matrices in the SVDs. The canonical angles are really small, all three of them, which means that all three rank 1 terms are the same, or at least the columns and the rows are the same, and then the concentrations can be different. And it's really easy. So it's computing canonical angles between subspaces in linear algebra. You can maybe I'm going to skip this one in the interest of time. And then the third, the last result is that if you don't know about the decomposition, it can be a BTD, then you have a more general theorem where there are now more matrices that need to have full column rank. There are actually two flattenings for which you need to match the subspaces. These yield some matrices that you can, transformation matrices between the basis factors of the two subspaces. And so whether it is a CPD or a block term decomposition, and the size of the blocks in these block term decompositions depends on the multiplicities of the eigenvalues of some matrices. And it all comes out very natural. So you see here condition 1, so matrices having full column rank. That's linear algebra. Second 2, condition 2, you need to compare some subspaces. That's canonical angles, that's linear algebra. You need to solve 2 sets of linear equations, solving for M1 and M2. That's linear algebra in least square sense. And then you look at M1 and M2, and you look at the eigenvalues of a single matrix, a matrix eigenvalue decomposition. And so the multiplicities of the eigenvalues will show you the size of the block terms. And actually, this third condition can be avoided in a later theorem. So it's all really, really easy if the only thing you want to do is compare 2 decompositions. I have here one application. You see here 8 signals. And these 8 signals, here you have the expressions, play the role of my underlying signals. And I will mix them together in some way. How will I do that? Well, I will create 25 observations. And each of these 25 observations, I have shown here 4 of them, takes some of the underlying signals, at most 5, sometimes less. Here only 2, here 4, here 5, with some coefficients. And so we have, in the end, a whole set of 25 signals generated from some underlying components in a sparse manner, at most 5. And they look like this. So 1 looks like this, 4 looks like this, 19 looks like this. We have 25. And the question is, you are given these 25 signals. What's happening here? For each pair, do they share the same underlying components, or some of them, or not a single of them, or just 2 of them? So in other words, you want to find this combination pattern here. So it turns out that this is a problem that you can solve just by basic linear algebra by using these theorems. And we did that. It's actually, again, a tensorization thing where the set of signals that we have here, we first map it to a tensor through some Hankel mechanism, and we will find block terms, and everything will come out in an easy way. So there are all 43 nodes, let's say, out of the 600 possible ones have been detected, even in the noisy case. And so you can perfectly do that, and so it's really a new tool, and that can be used, I think, in several ways. It opens some doors. For instance, it will also open this door. In systems theory, you have here a dynamical system, a second dynamical system, and you know that the autonomous response of dynamical systems takes the form of exponentials and sinusoids, etc. This is actually what we had here. So I deliberately took exponentials and sinusoids and maybe polynomials, and through this Hankel trick, you can express whether systems have the same, let's say, underlying working modes, operational modes, without having to compute these modes. And so you can just do linear algebra and say, look, here the rank is this and that, and these eigenvalues are close or the same. And you can compare systems without actually analyzing them and working like the guy in the picture, when it's just about comparing things. So this is the step then from blind system identification, which would actually be to find these components, to blind system comparison, which should also have quite some applications. Okay, so that's my conclusion. So we have for tensors various tools, SVD type tools for compression, which we have illustrated, CPD type tools for analysis, and then with some tricks, and you have also possibilities in the direction of pattern recognition and machine learning. In a numerically reliable way without the numerical challenges that you have here in the data analysis part. And there is one more slide that I would like to show, namely that a few weeks ago we have released an addition to TensorLab, which we call TensorLab Plus. It's meant as a repository for reproducible research, and we made the code available for like 34 of our recent papers, where you can reproduce the experiments and the tables. And this includes what I have shown here. So it's just available on the web, and you can generate the pictures that I have shown. It's just available online. So I will stop here. Thank you.
Fabulous. Thanks a lot for a spectacular talk. I will open up the floor to any questions that anybody might have.